There is a particular kind of pain to watch when someone spends real money to get real advice and then absolutely refuses to hear a single word of it. That's what happened when Darcey Silva walked into a professional matchmaking agency in Miami during her separation from Georgi, sat down across from a woman whose literal job is to tell people the truth about why they're still single, and proceeded to argue with every single piece of feedback she received. The matchmaker didn't find Darcey a wealthy husband. She found Darcey a mirror, and Darcey hated what she saw. I want to talk about this situation today because I think most of the commentary around it gets stuck on the surface level. Yes, the hooker comment was shocking. Yes, Darcey cried. Yes, it made for compelling television. But underneath the drama, there's something genuinely interesting happening, which is a woman who has spent years constructing an extremely elaborate version of herself for public consumption, and who finally sat across from someone who wasn't on her payroll, wasn't her twin sister, wasn't a reality TV producer with a vested interest in keeping her entertaining. She sat across from a professional stranger who looked at her dating profile, looked at her outfit, and told her the truth. And the truth, apparently, was a lot. My honest read on this entire situation is that the matchmaker consultation wasn't really about the outfit. The outfit was just the part that made it to air, and the part that got people talking. What the consultation was actually about is whether Darcey is capable of seeing herself the way other people see her. Based on everything that happened, I think the answer is, at least right now, no. And that's not me being cruel. That's genuinely sad, because you can see moments where she almost gets there, where reality almost breaks through, and then something closes back up and she reverts to defending herself instead. Let me give you the context here, because if you haven't followed the Darcey and Stacey spin-off closely, some of this might need a little unpacking. Darcey Silva is one of the most recognizable faces to come out of the 90-Day Fiancé franchise. She first appeared on the show with Jesse Meester, a Dutch fitness model significantly younger than her, and that relationship became famous partly because of how dramatically it ended, and partly because of how Darcey handled the ending, which is to say, not well. At least not on camera. After Jesse, there was Tom Brooks, which also ended badly, and then came Georgi, a Bulgarian man she met and eventually married. The Darcey and Stacey spin-off has followed all of this, including Darcey's plastic surgery journey, her relationship with Georgi, and the constant comparison between her love life and her twin sister Stacey's marriage to Florian Sukac. The matchmaker storyline happened during a period when Darcey and Georgi were not together. Whether this was a genuine separation or a temporary break that the show framed as something larger, I honestly can't say with certainty. What I can say is that the show presented it as Darcey being single enough to seriously pursue professional matchmaking, and that she hired Michelle, a high-end Miami matchmaker, to help her find a wealthy, successful man. That's the setup. Now here's where it gets genuinely complicated. The first thing the matchmaker apparently wanted to establish was what Darcey was looking for. And what Darcey was looking for, at nearly 50 years old, was a wealthy, successful man between the ages of roughly 25 and 40. I want to be careful here about how I say this, because age preferences in dating are personal, and people can want whatever they want. But here's the reality of what Darcey was asking a professional matchmaker to find for her: a man 20-something years her junior, high income, presumably successful enough not to need 90-Day Fiancé for exposure, and willing to seriously pursue a relationship with a woman who's also a reality television personality with a complicated public history. That's an extremely specific pool. And any good matchmaker, which Michelle appeared to be, would immediately start thinking about what a client like this is bringing to the table to attract that particular kind of person. Which brings us to the dating profile. From what was shown on the episode, the matchmaker pulled up Darcey's photos, and her reaction was, to put it gently, concern. The photos had been heavily filtered and edited to the point where the matchmaker described them as misleading. Now, heavy photo editing on dating apps is genuinely common, and I'm not going to pretend Darcey is the only person who has ever put a flattering filter on a profile picture. But there's a difference between a flattering angle and photos that are so altered that the person who shows up to the date looks significantly different from the person in the pictures. The matchmaker's concern, as I understood it, wasn't about vanity. It was practical. If you're trying to meet high-value men through a professional service that relies on personal meetings and real first impressions, sending them photos that don't look like you is going to create an immediate trust problem before the conversation even starts. Darcey's response to this feedback was to get defensive. And look, I get it. Nobody wants to sit across from someone and hear that their carefully curated image is actually working against them. That's a hard thing to absorb. But she had paid real money to get professional advice, and the professional was telling her something important. The editing isn't just a cosmetic issue. It's about what it signals to the men she's trying to attract. It signals, whether she means it to or not, that there's a gap between who she presents herself as and who she actually is. And men who have been around long enough, who are successful enough to be in a high-end matchmaking pool, tend to be pretty alert to that kind of gap. Then came the outfit. The mixer was a high-class singles event, and the matchmaker had presumably given Darcey some guidance about what to wear. What Darcey showed up in was, depending on your perspective, either a bold fashion choice or a complete misread of the room. The dress was tight, rhinestone-studded, low-cut, and aggressively glamorous in a way that read more like a night out in Vegas than a sophisticated professional event. The matchmaker, who had presumably seen a lot of clients make a lot of wardrobe choices, apparently reached a point of genuine exasperation and said something to the effect that the men at this event would not see Darcey as wife material if she dressed that way, and used a word that, on the show, got bleeped out, but which started with H. Let me be honest about something here. That comment was harsh. It was blunt in a way that crossed from professional feedback into something more personal, and I think a lot of viewers had a reasonable reaction of feeling like that was a step too far. Darcey is a real person, not just a character on a show, and being told in those specific terms that you look like something you're not is humiliating regardless of the context. But here's my actual read on what happened. The matchmaker wasn't wrong about the underlying point. She was wrong, or at least clumsy, about how she delivered it. The substance of what she was saying, which is that the outfit was sending a signal that was going to undermine Darcey's goals at that specific event, was accurate. Darcey dressed the way she always dresses. She dressed for Instagram, for attention, for the camera. And that's fine in the context of social media and reality television, where the goal is to be visually striking and get a reaction. But the mixer wasn't Instagram. It was a room full of men who were there because they wanted to meet someone they could build something with. And the opening impression matters enormously in that context. The reason I think this is worth talking about is because it gets at something deeper about how Darcey presents herself. Her whole brand, going back to the beginning of her time on 90 Day, has been about being visually aspirational. The hair extensions, the surgery, the filters, the rhinestones. There's nothing wrong with any of that on its own terms. Plenty of women lean into that kind of presentation, and it works for them in their personal and professional lives. But Darcey wasn't at the mixer to be visually aspirational. She was there to make a real human connection with a man who might actually want to marry her. And those two goals, at least on that night, were in conflict. What I find genuinely interesting, and this is my interpretation rather than anything Darcey has explicitly said, is that I think the heavily constructed presentation might actually be a form of self-protection. If you're always behind the filter, behind the rhinestones, behind the edited photos, then nobody is actually rejecting you. They're rejecting the image. The real you is still safe somewhere underneath all that. I could be completely wrong about this. I'm not a therapist, and I'm not inside Darcey's head. But as a pattern of behavior across years of public life, it seems consistent. The more she's struggled in relationships, the more elaborate the construction has become. And Stacey doesn't help, honestly. I want to be careful here because I think Stacey genuinely loves her sister, and I'm not saying she's deliberately cruel, but the show has repeatedly put the twins side by side in ways that frame Darcey as the one who can't figure it out. Stacey has Florian. Stacey has the marriage. Every time Stacey appears during Darcey's single era, looking settled and secure, it reinforces the gap between them. And I think that gap, whether it's real or partly a product of editing and framing, is something Darcey feels very acutely. The urgency she brings to finding a partner, the desperation that occasionally breaks through the surface, the willingness to return to situations that clearly aren't working for her, All of it reads to me like someone who is running from the fear of being the one who didn't figure it out. The mixer itself, by the way, reportedly didn't go well. And I want to be transparent that I'm working with what was shown on the episode, not any kind of behind-the-scenes knowledge. What came across on screen was Darcey going into the event in full Darcey mode, which, again, might work in a lot of contexts, but probably wasn't the right energy for a room where she was trying to project maturity and availability for a serious relationship. From what was shown, she didn't seem to connect with anyone in the way she was hoping. And sitting there, in that tight rhinestone dress, in a room full of people who had no idea who she was from television, she got a preview of what the real dating market looks like for her. It's not kind. Nobody in that room cared about her follower count, or her spin-off, or her story. They just saw a woman at a mixer, and for a lot of them, apparently, what they saw didn't match what they were looking for. I think that's genuinely hard to watch, even if you find Darcey frustrating. Because underneath the constructed persona, she's a person who is clearly in real pain about this area of her life. She wants to be loved. She wants to be chosen. That's human, and it's understandable. The problem isn't the wanting. The problem is the strategy. Now, let me give the counter-argument its fair hearing, because there's a version of this situation where I'm being too hard on Darcey and too easy on the matchmaker. The matchmaker's job is to help clients find connections, and part of that job is meeting clients where they are, not where you wish they were. If Darcey's presentation style is part of who she is, a good matchmaker might be expected to work with that, rather than try to fundamentally overhaul someone's identity in the span of a single consultation. The word she used was genuinely inappropriate in a professional context, and I think it would be dishonest of me to wave that away entirely just because the underlying criticism had some validity. There's also a reasonable argument that reality television editing is doing a lot of work here. I wasn't in that room. I saw what producers chose to show. It's entirely possible that there were longer conversations, more nuanced moments, and context that didn't make it to air because it wasn't dramatic enough. Darcey has spoken in various interviews about feeling like the show doesn't always represent her fairly. And while I can't verify those specific claims, the general observation that reality TV editing shapes narratives is not a controversial one. So I hold my analysis with a little looseness, knowing that I'm working with a curated version of events. And for what it's worth, Darcey's age requirements, while ambitious, aren't purely delusional. Plenty of women in their late 40s date younger men successfully. The issue isn't really the age gap on its own. It's the combination of the age gap, the specific pool she was targeting, the presentation questions the matchmaker raised, and whether she was genuinely ready to receive any feedback at all. One of those factors alone probably wouldn't be disqualifying. All of them together created a situation where the matchmaker didn't have a lot to work with. After the consultation unraveled, Darcey did something that is probably the most predictable and also the most heartbreaking part of this whole story. She went back to Georgi. Whatever your opinion of Georgi Rusev as a person or as a partner for Darcey, their relationship has been publicly contentious, financially complicated based on what's been shown on the show, and emotionally turbulent by Darcey's own account at various points. Darcey has described feeling controlled, has described feeling disrespected, has left him and returned multiple times. Going back to Georgi after the matchmaker experience reads, at least to me, like a decision made out of fear rather than love. The real world, the actual dating market, was terrifying. Georgi, whatever his flaws, was known. He was familiar. He was easier than doing the hard internal work the matchmaker, however clumsily, was pointing toward. There's a term in psychology, sunk cost fallacy, though I'm not going to pretend I can apply clinical frameworks to Darcey's personal life with any authority. But the pattern is recognizable. She had already invested so much in this relationship, so much time, so much emotion, so many seasons of television, that walking away permanently meant acknowledging that a significant portion of her 30s and 40s had been spent on something that didn't work. And that's an incredibly painful thing to accept. Going back allows you to avoid accepting it, at least temporarily. What Darcey paid for with the matchmaker, and this is the thing that I keep coming back to, was the truth. She paid a professional to tell her what's not working. And the truth the professional offered was, your photos don't look like you, your age requirements are limiting your options significantly, and your presentation at this specific event is not aligned with what you say you want. That's useful information. That's actionable. A person who was really ready to change their outcomes could take that information and do something with it. Instead, Darcey argued about the outfit, cried about the word the matchmaker used, dismissed the professional's expertise, and returned to the relationship she'd been trying to leave. I don't think Darcey is a bad person. I want to be clear about that. I think she is someone who has been in a particular kind of pain for a long time and has built a very specific set of coping mechanisms around that pain, most of which involve projection and performance rather than reflection. The filters aren't just on the photos. They're on how she processes feedback, how she relates to criticism, how she decides what's real and what she's willing to examine. And the matchmaker consultation, for all its messiness and its inappropriate moments, was about 45 minutes where all of those filters got stripped away, and it was too much. That's the thing about the truth. You can pay for it, hire someone to deliver it, and then walk out of the office and decide not to take it home with you. Darcey did exactly that, and then she went right back to square one. The ultimate irony of this whole situation, the thing I can't quite shake, is that she went through all of this. The cost of the matchmaker, the humiliation of the consultation, the awkwardness of the mixer, the very public broadcast of all of it, and came out of it exactly where she started. The matchmaker couldn't find a man. The mixer didn't produce a connection. And instead of sitting with the possibility that the common variable in all of her failed relationships might be something internal that she has the power to address, she framed the whole experience as an external failure. The matchmaker was too harsh. The event wasn't right. The men weren't ready for her. I'm not saying Darcey has no self-awareness. I think she has more than she gets credit for, actually. There are moments on the show where she comes close to saying something really honest about herself and then seems to think better of it. But self-awareness that never makes it to behavioral change doesn't do a lot of practical work. What I genuinely hope for her, not as a television character but as a person, is that at some point some version of what the matchmaker was trying to say lands. Not the word she chose, which was gratuitous, but the substance of it. That the gap between the image Darcey projects and the person underneath it is something that high-value partners, whatever that means to her, are going to sense and be put off by. That the urgency she brings to finding love is probably making it harder, not easier, to find it. That going back to something comfortable and painful isn't the same thing as choosing yourself. Whether any of that has happened since filming, I genuinely don't know. Reality television is always at least a little behind real life, and people change in ways that don't always make it to camera. I'm not writing Darcey off. I don't think that's useful or fair. What I do think is that the matchmaker consultation is one of the more revealing things that's happened on this show. Not because of the drama, not because of the word that got bleeped out, but because it was 45 minutes of someone refusing to let Darcey control the narrative. And watching someone who is very skilled at controlling the narrative lose that control, even briefly, tells you more about who they actually are than any number of glossy Instagram posts or carefully produced confessionals ever could.